All right, so today we're going to be talking about going around the rocks or moving the rocks. In the first 10 years of my career, I found myself working within technology companies that had one thing in common. They had found product market fit and were now in the scaling process, trying to grow like crazy, that hockey stick growth curve. And within that, they were trying to navigate the challenges that come with going from 5 to 10 to 100 to 500 to 1,000 employees. And when I was in those organizations, what I found is that our main job through this chaos of growth really was to make sure that everyone in the organization was focused on where we were trying to go and was moving in the right direction. Because as you're adding employee after employee after employee and you're growing at the scale that we were trying to grow, what often happens is that you've got all these new people, but they're heading in a million different directions, running as fast as they possibly can. And if you step back as a leader, what you realize is everyone's running quickly, but they may actually be running in directions that are wasting time and energy versus running collectively in the right direction, in the direction you need them to go. One of the organizations I was working within was a company called webmail.us. It was an email hosting company that was created before email hosting was really a thing. So it was created back in the days when companies had their email hosted in server closets down the hall from the CEO, and they were navigating all of the challenges that came with hosting your email in a closet down the hall from the CEO. And our biggest marketing and sales pitch and conversation that we were having with leaders was why it made more sense to outsource email than it did to host it on their own. And so if you take what we now know about the hosted email business, you can probably imagine what our trajectory looked like. It looked a little bit like we found product market fit, and within 3 years, we grew 1,000%. I'm not sure how many of you have worked in organizations with 1,000% growth, but I'll tell you it's literally mind-blowing. It was chaos on a scale that you can't even possibly imagine. And again, what we did is we ended up taking all of our people and making sure that on a daily basis, everyone knew exactly where we were going, and we did this a lot. You got it, keep going, keep running, you're good, and we ran behind them, and sometimes we ran in front of them, and sometimes we all just tripped over each other on the way, and we'd be laying on the ground face down wondering what the hell just happened. But most often, that's what we were navigating, this idea of everyone trying to run in the same direction. It wasn't until I actually left the quickly growing technology space, not really intentionally, but I ended up out of that space into a sort of new dynamic of business where I looked back and I realized that resistance was actually not one of the big problems that we had at webmail.us or at any of those technology companies. The problem we had was running so fast that we had to keep making sure there was alignment and there was focus. In 2005, as I was sort of not even intentionally transitioning out of that technology space, I was approached by a female CEO who had been invited to join a 100-year-old organization. And the board had made her goals pretty clear. We need you to take this organization and transform it so that it's prepared for the next 100 years. And she approached me and she said, hey, can you come join me on this initiative? And I said, well, no. Because that sounds daunting, and it's not a space I've ever played in. If you can imagine a 100-year-old organization compared to the startup technology world, they couldn't really be any different. But after a while, she got to me and she kind of inspired me to take on this new challenge. So I joined her in this organization, and for the next several years, what we worked to do was to take a ship that was 100 years old and to transform it, to turn it so that we were prepared to hit the point where we found product market fit again and we were able to scale the organization. And when I joined the organization, I came into it with a real blind spot. And that blind spot was for everything that needs to happen, not just to take a company that's ready to scale, but to take an organization that's not ready to scale and get it ready for scaling. And when I first walked in, I thought the tools and the resources and all of the ideologies that I had used in the former part of my career were going to help us get there. And we did all the standard things that you do. We created a new strategic plan. We got the board on board and invested in that plan. We worked with our leadership team. We did all the processes right to help this organization get to that point of product market fit. But yet, I would walk into meetings, and what I would experience was a leadership team who had some real tenure at an organization and just really didn't want to move. So I came from this place where what I was used to doing was chasing a bunch of people and trying to corral them, to this place where I was stuck trying to figure out how I was possibly going to take these rocks. Some of them were small and showed a little bit of a want to get on board, and some of them were so freaking big, I couldn't imagine how we were possibly going to move them. To give you a little more insight into the leadership team, there were 5 members of the leadership team who had been there for over 20 years. One of them was about to hit his 25th anniversary at the organization. The rest of the leadership team, with the exception of just one person, plus the CEO and I, the rest of that leadership team had been there for over 10 years. I had one person who had been there for 4 years, and then it was the new CEO and I. So if you can imagine what it's like 6 months in, when we've done all of the work that we thought it was going to take and we're still experiencing this level of resistance that was causing us to really worry that we were not going to be able to turn the ship. I had one day at that organization, again, it was probably about 6 months in, where I was just so frustrated. It had gotten heated. Some of the rocks were not just there, but were actively now trying to make the challenge nearly impossible. And I was so frustrated. And I had this woman, the one who had been there for 4 years, she came up to me and she said, "You know, you're like Nanny McPhee." "Have you ever heard of Nanny McPhee?" she asked me. I had not. How many of you have heard, I hear some snickers, right? How many of you, some people have heard of Nanny McPhee. She's a fictional character. I've since watched the movie, but she's a fictional character, and she's a nanny. And she shows up at the beginning of the storyline to the house of a family where the mother has died, and there are 4 completely unruly children. And she's not very attractive. In fact, she's sort of unattractive intentionally. And I thought to myself, well, this is kind of an interesting reference to be making, but all right. And so what happens is this nanny shows up, and nobody wants her there. The children do everything they can to sabotage her. The father wants her there, but he sees that there's not a whole lot of improvement happening in these unruly children. And through time, she teaches the children one lesson, and then another lesson, and then another. And every time the children learn a major lesson, something about her becomes more attractive. And by the end of the movie, she is physically quite nice looking. And the children have learned these great lessons. And now they're ready. The family is back in this cohesive place where the father had hoped they would be. And her main line is, "When you need me the most, you want me the least. And when you want me the least, you need me the most." Right? So this idea that when she shows up at first, the children don't want her there. But by the time the children love her and have accepted what she brings to the table, they don't need her anymore, and it's her time to leave. And in that moment, something really clicked for me in that environment that I was in, which is that the resistance I was facing wasn't something to get frustrated about. It wasn't something to start to get broken down by. The resistance meant that I needed to be there the most. And when the resistance, over the years I was at that organization, the resistance did fade. We used a number of the tools I'll talk about today, but the resistance faded. And I'll tell you what, when I left that organization, I was sad to leave, and they were sad that I was leaving as well. They didn't need me anymore because they had the systems and the structure. The resistance had faded, and the employees at that time in the leadership team were facing the same direction and running down the course they needed to run down so they could take that organization and continue to scale it. What I want you to remember, if nothing else, when you leave my presentation today, is that when you're experiencing resistance, it is because you are needed the most. So don't be beat down by that experience, by the resistance, and don't be frustrated by it. Today we're going to talk about understanding resistance. We're going to talk about structural tension and mapping your observations, uncovering your blind spots, creating an action plan, and utilizing your champions. Woven throughout this presentation, I'll give examples that speak to culture, and we'll talk about how culture impacts all of these things. Some tools that you'll leave with today: structural tension, observation mapping, Johari window, active inquiry, and a group facilitation exercise, all aimed at helping you work through the resistance you're getting from the rocks. Now, one thing I want to note before we move forward here is that in Kanban, you're actually taught to work around the rocks. And there's a real reason and time when that makes sense. Often, what you'll find is that by working around the rocks, you can create enough momentum that those rocks will start to move on their own. What I'm talking about today are some tools and some techniques to use when you're starting to be concerned that you've got some rocks that are going to inhibit your ability to achieve success in the initiatives you're working on. To start, let's talk about understanding resistance, humans versus rocks. I have 7-year-old twin boys, and when you put water and mud and rocks together, they are drawn to it like moths to a flame. Week and a half, 2 weeks ago, we went on a bike ride, and we're passing over this little bridge, and there's a creek below the bridge. And instantly, they wanted to get off their bikes and jump in, and as much as I wanted to say no, I'm trying to be the parent who says yes a little bit more, so I said yes. Before I knew what was happening, they were knee-deep in a creek, rolling in the mud, which is like every day of my life, picking up rocks and launching them. And I thought to myself, how interesting, we're on this idea of rocks because in Lean Kanban, you talk about the rocks as being the resistance points. And yet I'm watching my kids literally pick up the rocks and launch them into a new place in that creek. The thing about these rocks and about any rocks is you can force a rock to move. You just can. We've been doing it for centuries, right? You can pick it up, you can throw it. You can get 5 people, you can pick it up, you can throw it. If you want to, you could get a stick of dynamite, put it in the side of a mountain, and move a whole lot of rock. But wherever that rock lands, it is still there. It doesn't mean it's going to help you move to the place that you need to be. It's just going to sit there just like it sat before you forced it to move. Humans, you don't want to force them to where they need to go. You want to compel them to get to where you need them to be. Data informs and emotion moves. I heard this on one of Oprah's podcasts, and the thing I love about Oprah's podcasts is that they're informative and they're inspiring and there's lots of great information. One of the things I struggle with in her podcasts is that they do so many sound bites you can't tell who you're listening to. And this is one of those quotes I heard and I have not been able to go back and find out who said it. But this idea that data informs and emotion moves. If someone is a small rock and they're a little bit resistant, we can give them information. If we give enough people information and create some momentum, we may be able to move those rocks by which the people who a little bit of data actually helps them to get on board. But when you're talking about big rocks, we have to remember that the way to move them is not to throw them, it is to compel them to move. In order to understand the difference between rocks and humans, we have to talk about one thing that people often don't want to talk about. How many people go to work every day and hope that they get to talk about emotion? Yeah, a couple. How many people go to work every day and hope that the last thing they have to talk about is emotion? Couple? All right. When we think about emotion at work, what do we think about? Typically, first things that come to mind: anger, frustration, annoyance. I'm not sure what emotion gets us here, but crying. When we start to talk about emotion at work, people cringe. I once had someone say to me, "Oh, every time I sit in a room with you, I feel like we're talking about emotions." Ugh. Right? Uncomfortable. When we think about emotion, we tend to go straight for the negative. One thing that you may not know about me, my background is actually industrial organizational psychology. So it's the intersection of business and people. So for years, my entire career, I've actually really enjoyed talking about emotion at work. But it's not because I love dealing with situations where there's frustration, anxiety, situations where people cry. I struggle with those just like most people do. But the reason I love the intersection of people and business is because without emotion at work, we also would not have the opportunity to experience motivation, inspiration, or passion. All of us want to work on initiatives within organizations where people are motivated and inspired and passionate about helping us achieve our goals. Yet we cannot have any of those things if we are not willing to acknowledge that with passion and inspiration and engagement and motivation, there is also the other side of emotion, which is anger, frustration, anxiety, the things that lead to resistance. I had a leader say to me once, so I do a lot of executive coaching. A CEO recently said to me, "We hire employees and humans show up to work." So many organizations want employees to show up to work to do, but they want to compartmentalize the emotion that comes with being human. Whenever you are experiencing resistance at work, I want you to think about the fact that there is an emotion that is creating and causing and encouraging someone to hold on to that resistance. And without addressing the emotional side of humans, without being willing to go dive deep with them to understand what is holding them back, what is causing that resistance on an emotional level, you will not be able to move the rocks, especially the big ones. The bigger the rock, the deeper you have to go. So understanding resistance, the number one thing to understand when you're experiencing resistance is that you're dealing with a human emotion that is causing someone to hold on to whatever it is that is making them uncomfortable with making progress. The real question we need to be asking ourselves when we come up against resistance is, how do I compel this human to move to the place I need them to go? It's actually one of the biggest things I geek out about in business. I love nothing more than knowing where I need someone to go and figuring out how I, without physically moving them, can get them to go to exactly the place I need them to go. Let's talk about structural tension. This is a model that I use every single day of my life in so many instances I can't even tell you. I've used it within organizations to create strategies that are years long. I've used it in one-on-one meetings with employees to redirect and make sure that we're talking about the same thing. In order to compel someone to move, you have to make it very clear where you're moving and why you're going there and why it matters. This is the model that I use, if not on paper, in my head daily. The idea behind structural tension is that you have a goal, that you can articulate the goal, that you can paint the picture of what the goal is. And then we have this baseline of where we are today, right? Where are we going? Where are we today? And then that we ask people to walk with us up the ladder between where we are today and where we're trying to go. Here's the thing about structural tension. I'm going to use this rubber band right here to demonstrate it. If the goal is here and where we are today is here, there's not much tension. That's easy. You're not likely to experience a ton of resistance. But the farther we go from the goal to where we are today, what happens to the rubber band? Tension, right? When you're experiencing resistance, it's likely because the distance between where you are today and where you're trying to go is great enough that people are struggling to see what that ladder looks like to get you from where you are today to where you're trying to go. It's one of the things that I know you talk about in Lean Kanban. This idea that ideally we're not doing this with people, that we're creating milestones and incremental movement that keeps the tension between where we want to go and where we are today loose enough that we're not causing the resistance. So when you're experiencing resistance, it's likely because you're stretching too much on the model. The goal is to help walk people from where we are today up to where you're trying to go. When we're talking about resistors, we want to look for a combination of actual steps we're going to take plus what milestones we need to hit on an emotional level to get them to move with us up each step. All right, the next thing I do, I started mapping my observations after the incident where I was told that I'm Nanny McPhee. Because one of the things that struck me when I was going into this 100-year-old organization is that I had one too many, but probably, if I'm being honest, more than one too many moments where I was caught off guard because I didn't really understand where the person was that I was interacting with on this spectrum that we're going to go over right here. I'll give you an example. I was a few months into the initiative, and this woman on the leadership team pulled me aside, and she said, I've got this employee, and let me give you some background. She has been caught in the past not showing up for work when she says she's at work. She was remote. She's said that she has gone to certain territories and done her job when she actually hasn't. She has a history and a pattern of lying to me as her leader, and she's doing it again. And so I'm just wondering, how would you handle this situation? And I gave her some advice, and I walked her through, again, where are we trying to go? We're trying to figure out what to do with an employee who's lying, which quite frankly, I kind of have a lower tolerance for. And we are here. We've had a number of conversations. I gave her a couple of things I would do, and I said, quite frankly, if the pattern of lying doesn't stop, I'd remove her from my team. It felt logical to me. We leave the conversation. An hour later, HR shows up at my office door. I was like, and I came from an HR world, right? So I'm not hating on HR. My initial couple of roles were HR. But HR shows up, and I was just like, oh gosh. And I knew HR wasn't my biggest fan to begin with. She had been there quite a while. Didn't love where we were going as an organization. And she said, did you tell her to fire one of her employees? I said, well, I didn't tell her to fire her employee, but yeah, we had a conversation. And she said, you are not here to give out advice to leaders about what to do with their employees. And I said, well, but she asked me. She said, that's not what she told me. She told me that you overheard something and that then you told her to fire the employee, which of course was not true. But what I, besides being blindsided in that moment, what I realized is that I had miscalculated where that person fell in the course of feeling the resistance or being on board with what the initiatives were that I was trying to do. So I was intentionally undermined because I wasn't aware of what I'm about to show you. So since then, I've been using this concept of mapping your observations. So this is my own model. I've created it and utilize it. Feel free to create it or take it and use it however you can. But this idea that whenever you're working on an initiative, you want to understand how much influence every person on that team has and what their level of engagement is. One thing I want to point out with the level of engagement, to be neutral means no emotion really tied to it, right? They're there. They may not be a completely active participant, but they're willing to be swayed. This makes them really important. It can also make them really dangerous. Because what happens if you're neutral, if you've got people who are neutral on a project and they're hanging out with detractors? Detractors are highly disengaged. They have a vested interest in not going to where you want them to go. You put a neutral person in a room with a detractor, what happens to that neutral person? Bam, they're detractors. You put a neutral person in a room with a champion, what happens to that person? They become champions, right? Or they move closer to the champions. It's a little thing in psychology called mere exposure effect, right? What I do with this graph is I chart the people on my projects. So every one of these dots represents a person. The people all the way to the right, those are your champions. Those are the people who you've given the information to, they're excited about it, they see the vision, and they are ready and willing to run towards the place you want them to run towards. Those neutral zone people, they're still trying to figure it out. And then to the left, you have your detractors. What I failed to realize that day is that the woman who turned me into HR was actually a detractor. The good news was, long term, that her influence was low, and she ended up being one of the first people that the CEO escorted off of the leadership team, out of the organization, right? Ideally, you want your boss or the person who's brought you in to be as far right and as far north as they can be. if the person that brought you into the project is not as far right and as far north, you're going to have an interesting set of challenges. So once you've mapped out the team, there's something you need to be really aware of here, which is you're mapping your observations, which mean, let me ask you a question. Does that mean it's truth? It's not the whole truth. We have no idea if it's the truth. It's just your observations. So these are the behaviors that you're seeing in the situations you're in with these people. The next thing you need to do, though, is figure out, of the data points that you've plotted, how accurate are they? Is that truth? You need to uncover your blind spots. I'm going to introduce you to a theory called Johari window, but before I do, I'm going to tell you a little story about blind spots. I grew up in a family where my older brother was born deaf. And so if you can imagine, having a deaf child in the family leads to all kinds of really interesting stories. We call them the deaf kid stories in my house, and they're the topic of every Thanksgiving, every Christmas meal. There's one deaf kid story in particular, though. I was about 7 years old. My brother was about 9 years old. And we had a kitchen full of kids. Like, to this day, we can't quite understand where all the adults were, because every neighborhood kid was in the kitchen, but there was not an adult to be found. And my brother, he walks over to the refrigerator, he opens the door, he bends over to get something out of the fridge, and when he does, he lets out the loudest, most obnoxious fart you have ever heard in your entire life. He stands up, closes the refrigerator door, turns around, and we are hysterically laughing. I mean, you have a room full of kids, and there's nothing funnier in a room full of kids than somebody making a loud fart. So we're on the floor laughing, and he turns to us, and he says, "Do you mean to tell me that when I fart, it makes noise?" He was 9. And my parents had worked so hard to make sure that he had as typical and as normal of a life as a hearing child would have had. So the fact that he didn't know that farts made noise was mind-blowing to my parents. They didn't know what they didn't know or my brother didn't know what he didn't know until someone told him. This is an extreme example, but this happens to us all the time. We think we know. My brother thought he knew a lot about farts. But he was missing one key thing, and he didn't know until someone told him. When you're mapping your observations, there are things you will not know until you proactively seek out the answers to the unknown. To uncover your blind spots, I utilized this model called Johari window. When Johari window was first rolled out in the 1950s, it was actually introduced as a tool to help an individual learn more about themselves. But it has since been modified a number of different ways and utilized by different practitioners all over the place. And the way I use Johari window really is in a way to try to understand what I don't know in terms of the people on the teams that I'm working for, so that I can be anticipating resistance. The main thing to look at right here is where it says arena. So the arena is the area where the knowledge about a person, about why they're resisting, about the way that they're acting and behaving is known based on their behaviors. The information that you plot, you are plotting from the arena. The problem with that is that if you look below arena, you see facade, which is the information that that person knows that you don't know. Think about the example of the woman who turned me into HR. She had been putting up a pretty good facade up to that point. When she asked me for advice, I assumed that she was asking me for my advice. But the facade she had been putting up was a blind spot of mine. After that moment, I now knew what I needed to know, and I didn't make that mistake with her again. When we look to the right of arena, you see blind spot. Again, this is information that is not available to me. They know it, but they're not sharing it or showing it in any way. And then the unknown is information that is both unknown to that person and unknown to myself. That's the hardest stuff to get to, is the unknown. When you are dealing with someone who is resisting and showing behaviors of resistance, your goal is to get that arena square as large as you can get it. And we're going to talk today about a couple of things that I do to help expand this arena mark. 2 different ways that I go about working with people so that we can uncover blind spots. One is active inquiry, and the second is group setting. It is done in a group setting. Active inquiry is done in a one-on-one basis. Active inquiry is a huge tool that's used in the executive coaching world. So I'm a certified executive coach. I do a lot of work with executives, and this idea of active inquiry is a huge part of the work that we do. We're going to start there. When you have someone, so you've identified them as one of your bigger rocks, you want to start putting some intention and some intentionality and some focus on them. You're going to start with a one-on-one setup. The way to set this up is to meet with the person and to acknowledge some of the behaviors that you're seeing. Don't show them your graph. Okay? Keep that one to yourself. But you're going to acknowledge some of the behaviors that you're seeing. And when you're plotting people, you should, in theory, be able to be marking the behaviors you're seeing that you believe are leading to that resistance. The second thing, the story I'm making up in my head is, do any of you know Brené Brown? Gosh, I love her. She is my new American Idol. Someday, if I ever have her on my podcast, I will be able to die and go to heaven. She's fantastic. If you do not know Brené Brown, you should take a look at her stuff. She wrote the book Daring Greatly. She talks about vulnerability, which, again, that emotional thing that makes people shudder, but I get all geeky about. But she really talks about this idea of utilizing the concept of the story in my head. I used to phrase it differently. You could be saying, the thing I'm noticing is, or when you act like this, I feel. There's lots of different ways to say it, but acknowledge the behaviors you're seeing. Start to have this conversation with the person where you're saying the story I'm making up in my head is that these behaviors are because. Define the goal of the project. Going back to that structural tension model, what's your goal? Make sure that your goal is clear, that it's inspiring, that the person understands it. Reiterate why you're passionate about the project. We don't go to work on things that we don't believe have some kind of potential for that organization. What is it? What is the reason that you care so much about this project that you're willing to sit down with someone and have what, quite frankly, could be a really uncomfortable conversation? Share that with them. Ask them to help you understand the reasons that the project might fail. Right? Ultimately, the number one way to compel someone to move to where you want them to be is to show them that you care about who they are as a person, that their opinion counts, that you believe that they have something to show and something that can make this project more of a success. I have an example of this. I was brought into an organization, interesting because it goes back to sort of my technology days where product market fit had been achieved. The company really wanted to scale and grow, but I would say half the leadership team really wanted to scale and grow, and the other half of the leadership team loved the startup days. There's something so fun about the startup days, and something that is so fun and exciting about the startup days that there were some pretty good, sizable boulders on the team. I had a manager who was responsible for customer success and growing a behind-the-scenes production team, both in the US and in another country. And when I joined the project, the main goal was to take that team from 5 to what eventually became almost 50 employees in 2 different countries. And I took a look at this manager, I was in meetings with her, and something was just off. I knew we could not achieve this initiative if this manager was not prepared and able and excited to help us achieve these goals. They were pretty lofty, and the time frame was pretty tight. And everything I was seeing said to me she was exhausted. She'd been there a little while, and that she didn't have it in her. Everything in me said that the right thing to do was to walk her to the front door and to find someone else to take us to the place we needed to go, because that's how lofty and important this goal was to the organization. But I have this real innate belief that people want to show up every day to work, that they want to do a great job, that they don't really want to resist or to be detractors. No one comes to work to be the person that people don't want to be at work with. No one comes to work to be the person that everyone's rolling their eyes at in meetings or frustrated by or feeling like they're not on board with a project. So I sat her down in this one-on-one and I said to her, I think you're tired and I don't think you want to be here anymore. And I think that even though you know where we need to go, I think you see it so far on the top of a mountain and you're laying face down looking up this mountain thinking, how in the hell am I going to get myself and my team up there? And she sat there for a minute and then she did this. And I knew I had her. All I needed was for her to nod her head because that was my indication that she was ready to have the tough conversation. And I said, do you have it? Do you think you have it in you? And I talked about the reason I was there. I said, here's what I see. I see that you've been beat up in the last couple of years. I see that you have been dragged through so much change. And in many of those instances, your team has been the team that has struggled and suffered and been the group at the back of the bus who's at the whim of the front of the bus, and they're driving over speed bump after speed bump after speed bump, and your team has had the shit kicked out of them in the last couple of years. But here's why I'm here. And I explained to her what it would mean for the whole organization to be able to scale from 5 to almost 50 employees, what it would mean for the organization and for her and for me to successfully take a team and grow it in another country and in the US, and what it would mean for us to be able to allow the team to scale effectively and efficiently. And I said to her, I'm here because I believe we can do this, but I need someone in your seat who's willing and able to come to work and fight every single day so that we can achieve this. And if that's not you, I will help you find your next job. I will help you figure out your career path, and I will walk you with dignity and respect towards that front door in a way that you will go to the next best place in your life. But if you're gonna stay here, I need you to stand up and I need you to walk with us. And she said, I've got to think about it. That's perfect. What I would have loved is for her to jumped up, brushed herself off, and been like, give me the ball, coach. I'm going to run towards where you want us to go. But that's not realistic. That's not how people work. I needed to give her the time and the space to decide whether she was going to buy into where we needed to go. I needed her to decide whether she was going to move or whether she was going to walk out the front door. Either way, I was going to treat her with dignity and respect because that's what every human who comes to work with us deserves. By the end of that meeting, what we had also covered is every reason she thought that this was going to fail. I said, let's just lay it out. What are the things that are going to get in your way? We walked through some of the following questions, which is the part just after the setup. This is active inquiry, classic coaching, classic interacting with humans and trying to get in their heads. I don't know if I've told you this yet. Oh, I have. But I'll reiterate because it's my favorite thing. My favorite thing in the whole world is knowing where we need to go and understanding exactly what we don't know because it's tucked in someone's head, that if we knew it, would be the key to getting that person to nonchalantly, at their own pace, without me having to push them there, go to the place I need them to be. And the whole crux of this hinges on your ability to understand what's going on in someone's head. And the only way to understand what's going on in someone's head is to what? Ask them. I love good questions. Let's talk about some. Questions I like to ask during active inquiry that I walked this woman through. Not all of these, right? You don't list them out, but the general idea. First question, what would change in your world if this project is successful? There's two reasons I love this question. The reason number one, if their answer is positive, then you've already got them facing the right direction. Okay, great. What would that mean? Hey, what would that look like for your resume? What would that mean? Then it's easier that way. If it's negative, then we have a different set of things we've got to worry about. What is it about this project that you struggle with the most? Here's my goal. When I left the meeting with that woman, when she said I need to go think about whether I have the energy to stand back up, I wanted to know all the worst case scenarios. I wanted to get in her head. So what is it about this project that you struggle with the most? What's the number one reason you think this initiative is going to fail? Most of the time when people are resisting, it's because they don't believe in where you're going. Most of the reasons they think the project are going to fail are fixable. What's your number one frustration with this initiative? What are the top 3 concerns you have about our ability to hit our goal? If you could say one thing about this project without any repercussions, what would you want to say? And I'll tell you, I asked her this question. The answer was mind-blowing. She basically said to me, I want leadership to stop forgetting that every time they turn the wheel a little bit, my team gets thrown around at the back of the bus. It's like, okay, that's a great thing to say, right? I got to some great information with that. What's one thing you think the team is missing that if we focused on could improve our chances of success? By the end of this active inquiry and the group exercise I'll show you in a second, your number one goal is to have data points about the worst case scenario. You want to know every reason people think this project is not going to work, because then your life becomes really easy. Now you just have to solve for every one of those things. Easy, right? There's a question that I didn't add on here, but I wanted to share with you. I was talking to a manager just within the last couple of weeks, and I had, as a leader, made a mistake. I had been busy, I had been running too fast, I had missed a nuance on a project that he's running with that had the potential to make some pretty drastic changes in the way he had thought this project would work out. And I went to him and I said, hey, listen, I made a mistake. We're going to have to change this piece, and I knew it was a piece he really enjoyed. And I said, here's why, though. If we keep it the way it is, here are the three things that you're not aware of that are going to happen. And it's going to hurt not just this project, but our function as a whole. I explained the 3 things, and I said, so my ask of you is that we take that piece out of your initiative. And he looked at me, and I thought to myself in that moment, okay, I want to know what I don't know, which is he going to keep running on this project, or have I just stalled him? Have I caused some resistance? Have I caused something in him that's going to change his trajectory? And so I looked at him and I said, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you hate what I just told you? Right, super direct, super, like right to the point. Tell me what you hate. Why? Because I don't have time to go through all of this in that moment, but I need to know what about this are you going to go home and complain to your wife about? Because let's have that conversation right now. So on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you hate what I just told you? And he said, probably a 3. I was like, oh, okay, 3? Great. 9? Not so great. 3, we talked about it a little bit, and by the end of the conversation, he was like, I don't love it, but I get it. It's fine. Boom, off and running. Right? Now I don't have to worry about him. I can put my focus somewhere else. So that is active inquiry. To wrap up the example I was using about the woman laying on her back staring up the mountain, she came back to me a few weeks later. I don't even know if it was that long, actually. But she came back to me and she said, you know what? I'm ready. She said, it's not going to be easy. I know I have to find it within myself to make this happen, but I believe that you are here because you think we can make this happen. And she and I have been working together for 2 years now. She now has an international team. Half of them are US-based, half of them are international. And her team has met all of their financial goals. They have met all of their metrics, and they are thriving because I was able to work with her to turn her from that resistor into that champion. The second way to start to eliminate blind spots is that you can do it in a group setting. So if you're wanting to do this in a group setting, here's how I would facilitate this conversation. I would pull the whole group together in a room with sticky notes, Sharpies, and large sheets of paper. This part's kind of important. I've met more and more companies these days who want to do everything digitally. Like, let's just do it on Trello. Let's not do it on Trello. Let's get the sticky notes and put them on the freaking wall. There's something about doing this exercise on paper with Sharpies that can make a big difference. Whole group in a room. Restate the goal of the initiative and your excitement about the impact it's going to have on the organization. We're at the top part of that structural tension model. Run the following exercise. One at a time, ask them the following questions. Give them time to brainstorm their answers and write the answers down on the sticky notes. Have every person read their answers and stick the notes up on large sheets of paper on the wall. So you're reviewing all of the answers as they go. And then at the end, pull it together and utilize these as your data points for trying to figure out where the team is and how you can start to chip away at their biggest concerns. The questions you want to ask the group. What are you the most excited about in terms of this initiative? Right? Get people excited. Get them talking about it. This is a big deal. Even your resistors have to sit and listen to people on their team that they likely respect talking about why they're excited about it. That's going to do something. What are you the most frustrated about in terms of this initiative? Especially if you're doing this at a halfway mark or you're into the initiative already. What are you frustrated about? Let's talk about the emotion around it. And then, what are the top 3 things you believe we're missing that if we don't focus on could derail this project? I see lots of cameras. We will send this out, but I'm so excited to see so many cameras. I think that means you guys are learning something here, so that's perfect. So again, the point of the one-on-one active inquiry and the group setting, group facilitated exercise is to give you data points where you've expanded that arena and you've minimized the blind spots that you have. Once you have information, you can start to create your plan. So the next step is creating your action plan. Again, structural tension. If I haven't told you, I use this every day. It's like the thing in my life. Even with everyone I use, go back to structural tension. What is your goal? Where are we today now with all of your new data points? And what are those steps on the ladder you need to walk to get to where you want to go? All right, the question you need to ask yourself when you're creating your action plan is the rock ready to move? And can you compel the rock to move on your own? If the answer is yes, continue the dialogue. They've given you their biggest challenges. Go back to them and say, hey, here are the things I've thought about. How about if you personally help me solve this problem that you were concerned about? What do we need to do to put a plan in place? What would that look like? Can I put you as the owner of this? Keep that dialogue going and that rock will begin to slowly move. If the answer is no, you have another set of problems. I once was working through one of these initiatives. I was talking to a senior leader in an organization, not the person that had brought me in, but another senior leader in the organization. And I went through all this stuff, right? I've learned a lot of lessons now. I'm getting better and better at this. And I sat across from him and we talked about where we're trying to go. And he said, don't be offended. But I think the next thing you should go do is eat a shit sandwich. I mean, I tried. I want to say I wasn't offended, but I mean, I kind of have thin skin, right? So I was trying not to be offended, but I did learn something in that moment. The person who told me to eat the shit sandwich was a detractor with high influence. In my role, there was no way I was moving a detractor with high influence. There's nothing I could have done. Right? So I was cordial. Oh, thank you very much. I'll go have lunch now. And then off I went. But the very next conversation I had was with my champion, the person who brought me in, the person who believed in this project, who wanted it to be successful, who had a vested interest in my ability to help the organization get to where they needed to go. And I went to that person and I said this: do you want us to go in the direction that I'm trying to help you go in? He said yes. I said, what's it going to cost you if we don't go there? He said, we're not going to hit our metrics. We're not going to hit our sales numbers. We're not going to scale at the level we need to scale. And quite frankly, we're not going to hit, it's a high technology company. They want to ultimately be bought out, right? We're not going to achieve our ultimate goal if we don't transition out of startup mode and through scalability and into our teenage years. And I said, well, then you have a problem to solve, because here's what your leadership team's saying, right? And I sent the biggest champion and the biggest advocate of the project, the person with the most vested interest, back to that rock, and I told them they needed to solve the problem without me in the room. There are going to be times where you just can't move the rock. You can't influence the rock. You can't compel the rock. You can't love that rock enough to get that person to go to where you want them to be. And in those moments, what you need to do is go back to this chart. Who are your champions? Who are your advocates? How do you get those champions and advocates to go back to the person who's a detractor and say, dude, come on. If we don't do these things, if you don't get on board, peer pressure the shit out of them. Get them to compel the rock to move. As I round out my presentation today, here's a couple of things I want you to remember. Number one, everyone comes to work, my belief, everyone comes to work to be part of the future of an organization. They want to be on board with the projects and initiatives. They want to work in an environment where they are able to be part of something part of teams doing something big. When you experience resistors, understand what you're experiencing is human emotion. And the best way to get a human who is struggling to get on board, to jump on board with you, is to help them be part of the solution by understanding what's going on in their heads so that you can help compel them to move to the place you want to be. Here's what we covered today. And I'd love to open up the floor if anyone has any questions. Yeah.
This isn't a question, it's a statement.
Hang on one second. It's important to remember to speak into the mic because we are filming this today.
Okay. This isn't a question, it's a statement. I wish I'd heard this about 3 years ago.
Thank you.
A lot would have been different.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Anybody else?
So before I wrap, I see another question. Go ahead.
one ahead here.
Have you been in a situation where your detractor had more influence than your champion, and how did you navigate that?
That's a great question. The way I navigate that, I have been in those situations before. If your champion has less influence than your detractor, you have to have an honest conversation with your champion. Right? And it's hard to do this, especially if you're being brought in from the outside. Although if you're internal, you've got your own set of restrictions and fears about what might happen to have an honest and candid conversation. But what I have done and would encourage you to do is sit down with your champion, especially if in that example, is your champion the person that's paying you to be there or that's like your direct boss? Hypothetical. So if the champion is paying you to be there, yet someone with more influence than them is detracting, you would want to go to your champion and say, listen, let's talk about why this project matters so much to you. Let's talk about what it means if this project fails. And let's have a really honest conversation about the feedback I'm getting from the group that says that one of the main reasons this project isn't creating the momentum is because there's someone else in the organization with more influence than you derailing it. And then that's a coachable moment to help coach them on how to navigate that situation with the person with high influence. You will never win and create the momentum that you could if high influence detractors are there. What you do on the project or in the initiative matters less than how you coach those two people, coach that champion on how to bring the detractor along.
Yeah, so actually 2 questions, if you don't mind. First question is it ever appropriate to kind of stand up for yourself and then just be like, hey, you need to step off?
Yes.
Okay, second question, is it ever appropriate to say, hey, why don't we go have shit sandwiches together?
Yes. Yes. So I love both of those and I will address it. So one of the things that I have struggled with in my career, I have often and almost every time been the only female on a male-dominated leadership team, which does change the dynamic, right? I have an executive coach of my own because I believe in executive coaching so strongly. And I was going through this one particular, the shit sandwich scenario, and I called her, and you guys, I mean, talk about crying at work, right? I had some moments, and I had a call with my executive coach where I was literally sobbing because I was like, I don't even know how to approach it when someone tells you to eat a shit sandwich, right? And the truth is that wasn't the only sort of aggressive moment in that stint. There were a number of moments where I was being challenged in what what ultimately was an inappropriate and disrespectful manner. And I worked with the coach through that conversation, and where we got to was this place where I was armed with a comeback. Right? I can't even repeat what I wanted to say, but I wanted to say one thing. But instead, where I got to was a place where I had a line that I memorized and I put in my back pocket. And I waited for the very next time something like that happened. I pulled it out, I put it on the table. And that line was, I know that we're trying to get to the same place and that we all want to get to the same place together. But I think that we can agree that our journey to get there is going to be done with dignity and respect. And the next time, this was great. So the shit sandwich was a one-on-one. But the next time, it was months later too, you guys. I had to be so patient. Months later, I'm sitting in a boardroom, and there's 10 of us around the table, and somebody said something completely obnoxious. And I took my deep breath, and I said that. I know we all want to go to the same place, but I think we're going to agree that it's going to be done with dignity and respect, that this journey will be taken with dignity and respect. I threw that on the table, and I just was like... And the whole room, of course, you're in a situation there, the whole room, besides the person who said it to me, was like, yeah, I mean, of course we're going to agree to that. And then I just sat there quietly. So to stand up for yourself, absolutely. Absolutely in those moments. And I wish I'd learned that lesson years ago. That it's okay to pull that card out and put it there.
We have time for one more question.
Having just been exposed to a concentrated dose of Brene Brown, I have to ask, can you say anything more about, in the one-to-one active inquiry, how do you get a person of massive influence to be vulnerable?
It's a great question. I love the question of, if this doesn't work, what does it mean? Because I'll tell you what, the higher people get on the chain in organizations, the lonelier it becomes, and the more of a facade those leaders have to put on. It's one of my favorite things about executive coaching, actually. Some of the stuff CEOs of some of these enormous companies have said to me has been shocking, because they're willing to be so vulnerable because they need it so badly. So I always I would start with this idea of, if this project doesn't work, what does it mean to you? It means we're not going to hit our metrics. Okay, and if we don't hit our metrics, what does that mean? It means this, okay, and if that happens, then what? Right? And it is this, when you are having these active inquiry one-on-one sessions, it is all about lack of judgment. You are not there to judge why they are acting the way they are. You are not there to judge who they are or how they got there or what it is that they're going through. If you come from a place of just true compassion and wanting to understand what's going on in their heads, you can often ask a couple of questions. Well, what's it going to mean if that doesn't happen? The board is all over me, and I don't think I have their trust. I mean, when you start asking a couple of good questions, the stuff that comes flying out of people's mouths is fantastic. So thank you all for listening to me today and for being engaged in the conversation. Please keep in mind, when you are experiencing resistance, it comes down to human emotion. And do not be afraid of going for the emotion that people bring to work every day. If you combine the emotion with a plan and with a strategy, your people will move to where you need them to be, and you will experience great levels of success. So thank you very much.